This is KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California, and it's broadcast number 624, November 21st, 1983. We'll discuss for 1 minute, what happened just a year ago this evening. Judge Wood sentenced Mr. Charles Harrelson for not Judge Wood. Judge Wood was murdered, and Mr. Charles Harrelson bragged before the judge at his trial that he had helped kill John Kennedy. It was the trial of Judge Wood, who was gunned down in Texas a while back, and Charles Harrelson told him during the hearings that he had been one of the gunmen, and he drew a map of the area where Kennedy was shot in downtown Dallas, and the court literally threw him out. They said, this isn't a trial on the murder of Kennedy, it's on Judge Wood. So he's asking for a new trial right now, I understand, on some of the information that went wrong at his earlier trial. There's controversy last year when J. Peter Grace was given an appointment by Ronald Reagan for his cost control survey. We talked about that. This year he's still been working on ways to cut government expense. He's in the news a lot. And in this past year, W.R. Grace and the Howard Hughes Tool Company merged, which is a very dangerous situation. Not surprising, but that happened. I talked about Henry Kissinger and the art of staying in the public eye. That was in the Washington Post, October 20th, a year ago. And this year he's in the public eye all of the time. Probably the most obscene thing was Dr. Strangelove, following the movie on the atomic war, speaking and trying to put your fears to rest when he literally is the Fuhrer of America, he and Fritz Kramer. If you don't do something to smoke those two people out, you'll get Henry Kissinger as president, and don't complain. You have your chances now, and you can do something about it. The chances are running out. There's less chance now than there was a year ago, and everything should be done to get rid of Henry Kissinger and expose him for what he is. Just earlier on the talk show part of this program, before World Watchers started, I had a quotation of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which I believe is a good one, and I brought in apropos of this evening and this week. He said, "The existence of evil and malignant men does not depend on themselves or on men. It indicates the virulence that remains uncured in the universe, corrupting and hurling out, and that some people, some men, are rat-like, wolf-like, pestilent rats and tigers." Out there are two forces. There's them and there's us. And as long as you allow those Kissingers, those obscene, ugly fascists, to tell you that the bomb is okay, then you deserve the bomb on your head. That's all I can say. If you're fighting nuclear weapons, then you ought to fight Henry Kissinger or Daniel Graham, because they're sure putting them out there, and you're going to have to live with them. I mean, that just is true. I'm sorry. A year ago tonight, I was talking about Otto von Bolschwing and his connections to John DeLorean, to Chris Kraft, the corporation TCI, to the Sterling National Bank, to the Vatican. That was one of my favorite programs. If I could say, what is my favorite program? I think number 572 on November 22nd, 1982. It was a program where I took a lot of interconnecting links that were in the newspaper that week and brought them to the past and to the network, the Odessa network that I study so often. And it was a very creative week, and I like that program a lot. If you don't have the tape, you can get it. It's really worth having. It was a good one. Well, the good news this week was that WerBell came out, the issue of the WerBell. You can ask at your newsstands. Local people here can get it at the Thunderbird. A listener told me that she called and she asked them to order them. It's the premier issue of the WerBell, and on the cover is the swastika and a burning sign, and it says, "The Rise of the Fourth Reich, the Nazi Connections on the JFK Assassination." Now, the whole issue, the magazine, is very good. It's 96 pages, and it's filled with news and information. And it has the article by Mae Brussel. In fact, Larry Flynt had an ad this week in the New York Times on the WerBell, and the new article on the Nazi connections to the John Kennedy assassination. And I think I liked the article. I liked the research. I was very happy with the way it came out. And it's hard to condense 20 years' work into 54 typewritten pages. And it's hard to make a new point. People don't want to learn something new. Carl Sandburg wrote that in the poem, The Advice to His Son. It's very hard to get a new idea across. And after 20 years of blah, blah on the Kennedy assassination, obscuring the facts, and working for 20 years, I didn't just wake up one morning and have a new idea. I collected hundreds and hundreds of books and articles and files and extracted what I wanted to say in this story, and I think I was able to do it in that many pages. It's broken down into Roman numerals, into 5 parts. I think that way, into categories. The first part is the Nazi war years. I wanted a table of contents like you have at a play. You know what songs and acts and scenes, but they, for editorial reasons, didn't want it. The Nazi years, I break it chronological, 1940 to 1945. The Nazi connections of Reinhard Gehlen coming here to form the CIA, of Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS, and Allen Dulles and the Vatican and their role with Adolf Hitler. John J. McCloy and the Chase Manhattan and his role during those 4 years of the war and when the war was over. J. Edgar Hoover with Interpol and with the Nazis. And then Charles Willoughby, Karl Wiedenbeck, his real name, Adolf Wiedenbeck, from Heidelberg to Madrid. Those men and what they were doing in 1940 to 1945 that affect us right now today. The second part is the transition from 1952. In 1952, 5 important things happened, and they're in the article. 1, Klaus Barbie arrives in Bolivia, and that has some nice twists on who he stays with and the Nazis down there and the interconnecting links of the various corporate levels. And George de Mohrenschildt, the man who's going to be housing and feeding and transporting Oswald, and Klaus Barbie's gang in Bolivia. The second is Eva Peron dies, Evita Peron, and the Nazi money is released from the Swiss banks. A lot of these you've heard individually on individual programs, but to get it into a composite article is difficult. The third part of 1952 is Otto Skorzeny moves from Madrid to Madrid from South America and joins both Hitler's Gehlen operation and our CIA simultaneously. And under 1952, Nikolai Malox of the Iron Guard moves to Argentina, but he passes through Richard Nixon's office. Nixon was supposed to win the election in 1960, and when he doesn't, then the Nazis are in place to secure it for his presidency eventually and have a role in getting rid of John Kennedy. And then 1952, John J. McCloy releases the top Nazis from Germany like Hallmark and the Krupps and the Tysons so that they can begin rearming Germany. That's the year where the German Nazis are released. Hermann Abst, who's the head of the Opus Dei for the Vatican and runs the Vatican Bank right now, they're all released from prison and they all start operating right away. And then part 3 is on the election of John Kennedy versus Richard Nixon, and that segment's 1960. Well, that 1960 has to do with 4 organizations that were set up to kill John Kennedy or anybody else who stood in the way. The Christian Right, that's the Minutemen and the Nazis and the people that were working with Clay Shaw and Oswald's double in New Orleans. The Permindex operation of Clay Shaw with Reinhard Gehlen, and the international Nazis and the Schlumbergers and the Double Check group. The third was Robert Mayu and with Judith Exner and Sam Giancana and John Rosselli, and Mayu and the user organizations to Karl Boyer and the Tysons and the Krupps and the Apps and the Nazis in Germany. And fourth part is William Buckley's Young Americans for Freedom. And on the board of Young Americans for Freedom is Richard Nixon and Mr. Charles Willoughby and Robert Morris, the people that will play a role in the murder of John Kennedy or in his cover-up later. And part 4 is called A Few Connections in Dallas, and it has to do with General Walter Dornberger, the Nazi war criminal, with Michael and Ruth Payne, where Lee and Marina Oswald stayed. Lee Harvey Oswald and Albert Osborne. This is to Senator John Tower and Marina Oswald. Isaac Don Levine, the rabid anti-communist with the Zeiger daughters from Argentine, the Bunge Corporation, and the Argentine connections to the Kennedy assassination, and then the book Treason for My Daily Bread with Martin Bormann and the Nazis in the assassination. And part 5 is the Warren Commission, and I purposely downplayed that. There's been a lot on the Warren Commission, and I didn't do a lot on it. I gave a little essence of their personality, the people, their personalities on the Warren Commission, and a few things that they did showing the treason of Chief Justice Earl Warren, the shenanigans that he pulled, and Dr. Rudolph August Winneker, the German who was sent to write the Warren Report. And, of course, Allen Dulles and John J. McCloy worked with the early Nazis from 1940 on up till the time John Kennedy was killed, and Gerald Ford was put there by Richard Nixon, who worked with Nikolai Malaksa and Otto von Bolschwing and the Nazis at that time. I don't have too much about Ford. There's a little bit there. I mentioned in the article, it said what Gerald Ford wrote in a book, how the first meeting of the Warren Commission, they got information that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for the FBI, that it was a top secret meeting. And what I wrote was the part left out of Jerry Ford's book was that Oswald was an informant for the CIA and that he knew it at the time. That the first meeting of the Warren Commission privately before they took witnesses, they knew his number was 110669 of the CIA. I've had that document about 8 years, and this is the first time it's been published. And then I said, how was that for a starter? The Warren Commission got going. Local people can ask the Thunderbird to carry the Rebel. It will be out, distributed around the country. I don't know where, whether liquor stores or wherever the Hustlers sold to the distributions and bookstores. And if they don't have it, it's new. Ask them to get it. I just finished the second article for the next Rebel, and it's about Grenada and the invasion of Grenada and the secrecy. And it has to do with the medical school in Grenada and the mental hospital that was bombed, and the link of Caspar Weinberger and Ronald Reagan to mind control programs, and why the two of them had to have absolute secrecy in the invasion for 5 days, because 4 bombs were targeted over the mental hospital and the discrepancies in the bodies there. Of course, you can leave it to May to find something a little different in the stories, but the thing that I'm proud of is that I'm not a sensationalist. I study hard what I do. I take it seriously, and then when it's done, I hope it's done for all time. I don't have to backtrack. I've never been in a position, and I've mentioned it to you before, where I had to backtrack on what I had on the air or what I wrote. I'm proud of everything I wrote, and it will hold, I hope, for all time and open the way for some of you other researchers in the future. Now, that was the good news that this last week, Rebel is out. Now for the bad news, and I have to be careful in the words I use tonight. First, I wasn't going to do this particular broadcast. I was going to do a broadcast, but it was going to be a little bit different. I had to weigh in the balance what are the chances of something happening dangerous to Larry Flynt, and I decided nothing more dangerous can happen to him, so I'm going to tell you what's happening right now. Larry Flynt called me a week ago Saturday night and told me he had this wonderful idea. He was going to get an airplane, a 727 was hired, and he was going to jump over the ocean where Larry McDonald went down and go without a parachute. And I knew immediately that something terrible had happened to him. I haven't known him very long. I just got to know him when the article I wrote for the Korean airline went down, when I had called him and said, I'd like to do a story on Larry McDonald, and I feel that he was responsible with a group of people in Georgia for shooting you, and now they're trying to make a martyr out of him. I would want to tell the real story about Larry McDonald. So he got in touch with me, and he was calling several times a day, and he was so excited. He said, I'll give you a magazine, I'll give you the Rebel, and you can have your own magazine, and we'll get this out. And in about 10 days, the Hustler magazine will come out with the story of Larry McDonald called Murder Incorporated, and it's got the whole story in there that I wrote. It has his name on it. He asked if he could use his name, but you people know Mae Brussel, and I've told you I did it, and he won't care. Okay, so he calls me, the sky is falling, I'm going to Colorado, here's my phone number, they're going to drop a neutron bomb in Los Angeles, and so I got to get out of here, call me in Colorado, if Reagan's killed, they're going to kill him in Korea. And I knew then that he was out of his mind, he never talked like this, and this was so silly. I said, look, you're talking like Jim Jones, somebody has your head, somebody's dropped something to you, and I didn't know who was there at the house, I didn't know what was going on. Then I get a phone call a few days later from a Mr. Barron, the attorney for Marvin Pankos. Pankos is the man charged with killing Vicki Morgan. And he said, you know who has moved into Larry Flynt's home? And I'll tell you who it is, and if you don't know the name, I'll read you some sections from a book describing these characters. One is Mitchell WerBell of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's a white czarist, white Russian czarist who's been responsible for every silencer and every military coup that came down in the United States and had a role in every single one of them. And here is Larry Flynt publishing an article on the Nazis and the Kennedy assassination, all new material, and you better run out and get them because they'll be rare. Get your hands on some, But here he's publishing this, and he's writing the real story of Larry McDonald and McDonald's work with Pinochet. And there were a lot of things that happened, and I listed them, that moved very swiftly. He had asked, he had the tapes, the Vicki Morgan tapes, the famous ones that were supposed to be of the president, and blackmail the president. And he said 2 weeks ago, what should I do? And I said, I would give them back because they'll kill you if you don't, but sell them back. You paid $25 million, just get your money back. I'll take $1 million and build a research center, and we'll go that way. He says, okay. In the meanwhile, Gordon Novell and Mitchell WerBell moved into his home. Here's a man who has $500,000 a year of security at the minimum, walkie-talkies, guards, telephone outside the gate, every kind of security. And into his house walks Mr. CIA, probably with more noxy than George Bush ever had. He does all the dirty work for Bush. This man knows every intelligence operation going on in the world today. He is Mr. World. He trains down in Georgia, the paramilitary group, and in Texas, and works with, as I say, with the silencers. I always wondered, did he provide the silencer for Dealey Plaza? And the Umbrella Man, Bob Cutler's wrote a book that he thought Gordon Novell was the Umbrella Man, and Jim Garrison wanted him to testify before the grand jury when he arrested Clay Shaw. And Gordon Novell left there, and Richard Nixon called him in, he's an electrician, to wipe out the White House tapes. Everything I'm saying about the men is in public domain. It's in published books, so I'm not talking against them. I'm just telling you who the house guests are. So Larry Flynt sent out letters to various people that he knows, and this is dated November the 16th, and it seems that they've talked him into killing himself. They're not going to kill him, he's going to kill himself. And this only happened very quickly in the last 10 days. The following telegram was sent to the ambassador of the Soviet embassy in Washington. On Wednesday, November 23rd, I intend to fly over Seoul, Korea, via the same route as Korean Airlines Flight 007. I intend to jump out without a parachute at the same location where McDonald went down. I must do this to save the world. Kissinger is in complete control. He has gone mad and must be stopped. Bush and Kissinger plan to assassinate Reagan. CIA killed Jessica Savage and Bishop in Grenada. Agency had 5-day warning about the incident in Lebanon. World War III is imminent. If Korea will not waive visa requirements, I will request Soviet Union to allow my pilot to land in Russia. The type of aircraft I will be flying is a 727. Please advise me as soon as possible. Larry Flynt. Then he puts his address and his telephone number. If any of you want to call there tonight, 213-471-3441. Call down there. Someone will answer. He's supposed to be going to Dallas tonight to duplicate the motorcade. Tell him, please don't do this. Don't die for nothing. This is like Dr. Olson, Mr. Olson, who was at a CIA compound and was visiting members of the CIA, and they slipped some tasteless substance into his food, and he calls his wife, I won't be home for Thanksgiving or some nearby occasion. I'm going to New York for the weekend. And she thought it was on business, and he went flying out of a 20-story building. And 20 years later, the CIA admitted that they gave him something that had him jumping out of a building. Now, I said to Larry Flynt, don't do this. This is the time where information is power. Now you have the rebel. You have things happening that are real. But he's between a rock and a hard place. They moved into the house. They're there now. He called me last Monday. I said, is Gordon Novell in the room? He said, yeah. I said, I can't talk if Gordon Novell's in the room. I talked to him today. I said, look, I'll go to L.A. tomorrow, and I'll have you put in a mental hospital. Nobody should fly you or take you out of this place. Mental places are for those who are not in control of their own lives. He's been acting silly, discredited, because he's publishing some of the most important material that has ever been published in this country. So now Mitchell WerBell went to court with him last week when he had a flag draped around him like a diaper and acting silly. If you wondered what happened to him, this is a public display of what is going on. Now, before I knew they moved in the house, I didn't know who was there. I called Terry Moore because she watched the way Howard Hughes was kidnapped from 1957. And he was drugged by Bobby Hall and Jack Eggers, the Beverly Hills police. And every once in a while, they would let him appear in the lobby of the Beverly Hills Hotel so everyone would know that he was loony. Then when his friends wanted to see him, they'd say, can't talk to you. Or if they'd call, they wouldn't let him talk to them. And he was totally isolated, and they thought it was his wishes. And Terry always regretted that she didn't interfere or try to help Howard in some way. Well, we make mistakes in the past, but we don't have to make them in the present. And hopefully we learn from these mistakes. So I asked Terry Moore to go over with me and see if we could talk to him. But then I didn't know that these people had moved in. What can you say? What can Mae Brussel say to Mitchell WerBell and Gordon Novell after you've talked about them on the air for how many years? What can you say to these people? There was an article in the L.A. Herald about John Kennedy, and it was written by Joe Morgenstern, and the gist of the article, he said, if we must cry, let it be for today's tragedies, for what's happened since. And he goes into some of the things that have happened. And he says, it's silly to spend more tears on the man. The trick is to bring our passions to bear on the present, to recapture some grasp of the future. The people running our country at the moment offer no future at all. They can't comprehend a cause for genuine hope when they find one, so they plump for things like nerve gas and spend pittances on things like fusion research, which offers few prospects in the future. They've lost touch with the aspirations of youth. They divert money from millions of children's education and nutrition to buy something that is redundant or useless weapons. And then in a masterstroke of hypocrisy, they go to court on behalf of a miserably handicapped and retarded infant who's got no chance of ever enjoying a full life. Maybe it's a good place to start for anyone who feels like crying. And that's the way I feel about this situation. This is not the time to talk about John Kennedy. It's the time to talk about now. Well, what was happening when Larry Flynt's house guests arrived and moved in? I looked over the 2 tapes that he sent to every member of Congress. After he met me, he was so enthusiastic. He spent $6,000 and sent broadcasts to every member of Congress. Remember, there's the Jesse Helms and the Strom Thurmonds and the Dentons and Jeremiah Dentons and the raw fascists all over the place, and a good hunk of them working with security and intelligence. And what tape did they receive? Remember that there were over 500 cassettes sent 2 weeks in a row, and one of the cassettes came back from William Proxmire, and the other, I got a very gracious letter from Congressman Panetta, who lives in our area, saying if there's anything I can do to help you. At least he was a gentleman and acknowledged it, and the other 500 didn't. Larry spent $6,000. And in return, the thanks he got for his brand of patriotism was Gordon Novell and Mitchell WerBell move into the house. Well, I looked up to see what they got that would anger them. You see, first of all, the DeLorean case wasn't that big. I think the government gave him the tapes for a pittance because they want it thrown out. They don't want DeLorean to go to court. So he's actually doing them a favor with the DeLorean story. The Vicki Morgan tapes are something else. If the president's embarrassed, then we get George Bush. And I always wondered if the tapes were available so that Ronald Reagan would be embarrassed and we would slide Reagan out just as they did with Richard Nixon and the tape, Scotch tape. And then George Bush of the CIA would be president of the United States. I wouldn't mess around with those movies anyway because they're none of my business. I think if people, want their sex, they should have it. But anyway, he has them, and that's trouble. But what else did he do? He published the article on 007, and you'll see it, and he got out the issue on the rise of the Fourth Reich and the John Kennedy murder. And then he sent these tapes, and I looked to see what they got there. The tape is about Lieutenant General Graham, who is touring the country, pushing his high frontier weapons with his political action committee to get those space stations and genocidal slave labor camps going up there. And it printed the address of him with Dr. Fritz Kramer. Now, that's not a household word, that address with the telephone number 202-484-5033. So every member of Congress had Fritz Kramer and Daniel Graham's address on it. Then there was a section of that tape on the dead chief of the gold company, Alan Saxon. Those $60 million haven't been found with the gold bricks, and it mentions Johnny Carson and Henry Bushkin and Jack Catane and the mob in Beverly Hills. Well, Carson was part of Ronald Reagan's inauguration and a Mr. Republican, so I don't suppose Congress liked that. Then the tape asked the question, what was Larry McDonald doing in the Cayman Islands before the plane went down? Or Catherine McDonald and her role in being in touch with the National Security Council while the president was asleep, that she knew something nobody else knew, and her role being advised about the airplane, as I say, before the president knew. On the other side of broadcast 617 had to do with Roy Cohn and Larry McDonald and Western Goals, and Roy Cohn and General Daniel Graham. I don't suppose there could be a more important tape. I haven't looked at all the sheets, but this is a lot of information. When you tap Roy Cohn, you tap trouble. I mean, people said don't send out things about Roy Cohn, and he's the common denominator between the space stations, the Vatican, and the Mafia, and the hit teams. And Roy Cohn is on the board of Western Goals, Birch Society, and the military, and the combined forces, the radical right. So that broadcast 617 is one of the things, looking for a reason for this drastic move, because when the top boys move in, you may as well just kidnap him and take him away. Then the next broadcast he sent them was number 618, and this was about 20th Century Fox and Mark Rich. Well, he's a partner, has 50% of 20th Century Fox, which is Henry Kissinger and Marvin Davis, and it has to do with Cardinal Cody and Cardinal Cook. And Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York with his propaganda against the Soviet Union. And D'Amato is one of the advisors and spoke at the graduation of that school, St. George's University, the medical school down in Granada, has links to that school. When I did that broadcast, I didn't know his links to Granada and the government down there. It also is about Tom Pappas and the paying of the election of Spiro Agnew and Pappas and Nixon, how the CIA recycled money to buy off that 1968 and 72 election, and the role of the Los Angeles Police Department with John Belushi, and the combination of W.R. Grace and Hughes Tool Company, and Ebel Younger coming out of the woodwork with his new laws. I suppose I look at the sheet that goes out with the broadcast every week. If you subscribe to the tapes, you get the sheet. If you don't, you send self-addressed stamped envelopes, and I send you a bibliography if you want it. And I go down the line, and I say, oh, my gosh, did I say all that? I mean, no wonder they're after poor Larry Flynt. He sends out these tapes to every member of Congress. And I have had a terrible week because a deadline was due for the next Realist. Rebel, the Realist was a long time ago. I'm meeting a deadline for one magazine, and I'm wondering, is he going to be alive another day? And how is he living in terror? And how do you extricate yourself from this and feeling that in a sense, I played a role. And in a sense, he picked up the ball and went for it and courageously wanted to tell the people what happened. And now he's in a castle in Bel Air and he's paying his dues. And this is the American tragedy. It's 8:30. Now we're going to take a 1-minute break and then come back to the second half of broadcast 624. And when we take this break, I always ask for money to the station. I haven't asked if you're sending it in. I don't know. I assume you are. I'm sure it's coming in. We're still on the air. The winter comes and those rainstorms are terrible and the towers go down. So if you can subscribe, be a member to Kazoo and send in something and say, hey, there aren't many ways to get information out anymore. You understand that? And here is somebody like Larry Flynt, whose life is on the line. And I've had 13 years on the air. It's very important to appreciate your freedom when you have it. Do you appreciate it? Because you lose first the publishers and then eventually, they take away the means of communication. And that's very important. Information has to be disseminated and the system knows how to take away the means of communication. This is side 2 of broadcast number 624, November 21st, 1983. They were talking about the movie, the nuclear movie on television. Mr. Pearl of the State Department was talking about that. And Evans and Novak, very conservative, were saying to him, do you blame the people who made the movie for, it was tantamount to treason going against Ronald Reagan's wishes. Who do you blame for this kind of broadcasting? And Pearl said, I blame the ABC broadcasting because without them communicating the message, people wouldn't care about the movie. And that, in essence, is the tragedy that happens when somebody has information and has good information, how then they're blocked, they're cornered, and you can't get it out. Now, Bernard Fensterwald, who's in the CIA, he's worked for the CIA, he's the attorney for people like Mitchell WerBell, and he's the attorney for James McCord, so I'm not saying anything against him. He wrote a book, and he described Gordon Novell, the fellow that is living in Larry Flynt's home. He wrote about Clay Shaw and the Permindex Corporation a little bit, and then he described the Gordon Novell, the character of Gordon Novell. He said Novell is a young electronics expert. He became involved in Jim Garrison's investigation, the charges of Clay Shaw and the murder of Kennedy, when he volunteered to provide information relating to Cuban exile activities. Garrison accused Novell of being a plant in his house at that time and announced he was investigating Novell's connections to David Ferrie and the Central Intelligence Agency. Novell was subsequently involved with Watergate conspirator Charles Colson in the mysterious plan to erase some of President Nixon's secret Watergate tapes. In March 1967, District Attorney Garrison subpoenaed Novell to testify about the August 1961 munitions burglary in Louisiana, which was carried out by David Ferrie and Sergio Acacio Smith, a Cuban exile leader, and Gordon Novell on March 16, 1967. Before appearing before the grand jury, he told reporters he would testify about activities during 61 that related to Mr. Smith. But when Garrison wanted another subpoena to talk about those same people and the murder of John Kennedy, he disappeared. He showed up in Columbus, Ohio, and has never had to appear in a court to tell his relationship to the murder of John Kennedy. He wasn't interested in doing that. Novell seemingly was warning a former intelligence contact that Garrison was investigating Novell's connection to the Bay of Pigs. This is Clay Shaw, the trial of Clay Shaw, when David Ferrie and Clay Shaw were involved. And as soon as Jim Garrison arrested Clay Shaw, David Ferrie was murdered. And Bernard Fensterwald is writing about a letter written. It says, this letter is to inform you that District Attorney Jim Garrison has subpoenaed myself and associate to testify before the grand jury on matters which may be classified top secret. The actions involve dual individuals connected with Double Check Corporation in Miami in the first quarter of 61. Mr. Garrison is unaware of Double Check's involvement in the matter, but he has strong suspicions. and he would not go into the role of the Bay of Pigs invasion, the CIA, the double check, because they were later involved in the murder of John Kennedy. And he said he just wasn't going to show up. And there's a picture of him in Bernard Fensterbald's book on Gordon Novell. Then it says, Novell was finally compelled to return to New Orleans for questioning by the grand jury in April of 1967. He made his first appearance in court the afternoon of April the 3rd to post bond for his arrest. He then hinted at a cover-up in the case and was suddenly interrupted by his lawyer while beginning to mention the name of a particular Cuban exile. The headline said, "Witness in plot investigation hints a Cuban link." On the night following Gordon Novell's court debut, President Johnson's top aide, Marvin Watson, called J. Edgar Hoover's top aide, Cartha DeLoach, and informed him that President Johnson was now convinced that the CIA was involved in the Kennedy assassination. Novell was hinting, if you put me on the stand, I'll let you know about the conspiracy. And, of course, then we never heard any more about it. I had an idea for this anniversary of Kennedy's death that we should go in front of Larry Flynt's house and call a press conference and tell the press that there are two men inside that will tell them on the 20th anniversary who killed John Kennedy. And Don Freed wanted to do it with me, and I spoke to somebody at the L.A. Times. But then I was afraid that Larry Flynt would be murdered if we pulled this. I didn't know that the great suicide trip was going to come off the next day. I don't want to be responsible any more than I have been for the mess that he's in. So I'm not going to be in front of his house. There's not going to be a press conference. And I think he belongs, if he's been drugged with the MK Ultra drugs, he belongs in a mental hospital. You can get a 72-hour hold on the basis that you protect a person from themselves. And this is obviously suicidal. And I called Mr. Barron's office today. He didn't call back to see if we can get some people, the doctors or the police, to hold him back, not drive him to any airport, because they're driving him to his death and they're a part of the murder and the suicide. And the whole thing is that he should come off the MK Ultra and get treatment and go back to doing what he was doing before somebody planted the idea that he should kill himself, because it was never there until these house guests arrive. Now, in the book Spooks, I just copied a few sections to share with you to give the essence of the house guest that is staying there, because this is Mr. Big of the entire United States. As a matter of fact, Jim Hogan's book called Spooks begins with Mitchell WerBell. The first 28 pages are on him because he's the most important spy probably in the world now that Otto Skorzeny is dead, and he worked with Hitler Skorzeny when he was alive. And the book goes into Robert Mayhew and Mitchell WerBell, and he says the archetype of the master spy, Bell, is certifiably lethal with his hands, a master of Chinese knifing, a crack shot, a brilliant interrogator, a legendary inventor of spy tech. To add that, he's somewhat of a mystic. He works in ESP, and it goes into his mysticism. WerBell is like a man in love with death. He has spent his life courting it, a specialist in the development of assassination devices. He moves from one capital to another, arranging coups d'etats while flogging the most murderous devices that he can invent to fugitive millionaires and third-world fascists alike. It's all legal, whatever its morality, and the weapons that filter down to the commandants of political death squads. Men whom WerBell admits he probably knows it's none of his affair, so long as his papers are in order and his politics are right. He'll show up with these people. He has all kinds of dirty tricks, the lethal light bulbs, the telephone receivers, etc. That is Mr. Death. Would you like him for dinner tonight? And telling you, I will help you rent an airplane and you can go out over the ocean in that nice cold ocean, as if Larry McDonald were his hero, okay? Spook says the clients of such people like the WerBells are the financial establishment, the Hughes organization, the Hunts, H.L. Hunt, the Rockefellers, the Gettys, the Fords, the Niacaros, the Grahams, the Mellons, the ITT, the Exxons, the Chase Manhattan, Northrop Bell Telephone, American Express, Marriott Corporation, and one of the big investors into Mitchell WerBell's corporation is Stuart Mott. The image of the American left, okay, he has invested heavily into Nobel's company. The Virginia headquarters are deck door, counterintelligence, and Colonel Bell tells the significance of his fighting wand and all of his other equipment. Mitchell WerBell doesn't wear cufflinks, Hogan says, but if he did, they'd probably contain explosives. The cane he carries conceals a small but serviceable sword. Larry Flynt had to go to court last week, and Mitchell WerBell went with him, and he was arrested. WerBell had posted like $6,000, which is nothing, because he had a weapon in court. It was this great cane that he carries, his stick. He has a swagger stick that doubles as a rocket launcher. Our soup's on, Mr. Flynt. Let's get our dinner. When he's on a business trip, his attaché case is neatly fitted with the tools of his trade, a featherweight submachine gun nestled in deep velvet beside a specially designed silencer. Together, they're capable of squeezing off 800 rounds of ammunition in a minute and almost perfectly preserved quiet. WerBell is a spook who specializes in the craft of assassinations and the freelance coup d'etat. He loves his work. You like that one? And then in the same paragraph, the same introduction, he talks about Bobby Hall, who worked with them, and he was the man who drugged Howard Hughes with Jack Eggers of the Beverly Hills Police, and their blackmailing operations for Howard Hughes and working with Robert Vesco and the CIA, and their calculated smears and surveillance and their spy operations. This is Mr. Spy, who has moved into the house. He refers to Edward Bennett Williams, Robert Mayu, Mitch WerBell, the spooks at Intertel, and the user organization. Their paths crisscross in what amounts to a plenum of P-L-E-N-U-M, plenum of secret agentry, going all over the world with headquarters in Georgia, a mansion in Costa Rica, suites in Houston, Atlantic City, and so forth. The map is filled with their presence. WerBell, with a huge handlebar mustache, is a paratrooper. He's depicted in battle dress as a paratrooper with his boots, Australian bush hat. He usually has his Ingram M10 submachine gun cradled in his arms as often as not as his silencer. I might say right here, because I may not have time later to include this, that when I went to Los Angeles to make a movie called The Howard Hughes Mystery, Manuel Zecima was from Nicaragua. He had a distribution company of films. His offices were on Robertson Drive in Beverly Hills, and the movie that we made was destroyed, The Howard Hughes Mystery, and Broderick Crawford was in it, and I played an investigator, and I had about 6 scenes, and then we filmed it again, and that was destroyed, and then Manuel Zecima was forced to leave the country, and from all I know, he hasn't been back seen. There was no Hughes movie. And then I met Terry Moore through him and helped write a book with her, ghostwrite a book with her, and worked there for a couple of weeks, came back to Carmel, went back to our house, and in her living room was a man sitting in a chair. Some of you know this story, and his wife is Marge. Her name is Marge. She did typing for Ronald Reagan. And the living room was an arsenal. It's the first time I ever sat around. I didn't sit with him. He sits there. They had a trailer. There was an armed camp at Terry Moore's house from a nice home, a nice lady, and her mother and her 2 kids, writing a biography about the Hughes organization, and Marge's husband is sitting there with rifles and all kinds of pistols or what have you. Well, she takes the scissors and cuts up what I wrote with Terry Moore. And that is the problem of getting out publications. If you say, why doesn't Mae Brussel write more? I'm game, but look what happens in the way of getting publications out. When I first met Paul Krasner, he was enthusiastic, he was brilliant, he was excited, he was full of piss and vinegar. He couldn't wait to get The Realist out. Why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped? He was living up at Watsonville. And he published 3 of my articles. The Senate Select Committee is part of the cover-up, and the SLA is the CIA. By the time he got the SLA article done, Krasner was like a vegetable. He was so full of whether it was peyote or LSD and marijuana and hashish that his mind was scrambled for a long, long time. He's doing stand-up comedy now. He's been writing his autobiography for years. He virtually just went into seclusion for a long, long time. He worked for Larry Flynt for a while. Flynt set up headquarters for his other article on the John Kennedy assassination, and 1 month after it was published, Larry Flynt was shot with 3 bullets and was left permanently paralyzed and is in a wheelchair. And so he recovered. He had about 5 years of recovery. He's living in constant pain, and finally had some laser surgery this last year. The pain went away. So he decided he'd make his splash into the world and come out with the WerBell. And the same week before the WerBell comes out, the agency moves into his home, and he is like a virtual prisoner inside of his home, prepared to die. This is the American tragedy. When I tell it to you on the air, it seems so unreal that I can almost say it without breaking down. All week, it was the hardest week I ever had. I was so perplexed about the idea of those people there, that here he's telling the story of the Nazis, and these men worked with the Nazis, worked with Galen's men in the operation. They know from A to Z who killed Kennedy, and here is the only publisher in America who has the nerve to print who killed John Kennedy in that article, and the network of the cover-up and the agents involved who should be brought in. And in his home, simultaneously, are those people that can endanger his life, but rather than take it, get him to take it himself on some flimsy excuses. And also, something was accomplished this week that Larry Flynt did once before, and when I met him, he was aware of the role of Dick Gregory and Mark Lane in covering up his experiences when he went to Georgia, that Robert Byron Watson knew that Larry McDonald and that group were Murder Incorporated, that Lane knew it and Gregory knew it, and they didn't tell him, and he went to Georgia and was shot. And all of a sudden, Dick Gregory is at the home of Larry Flynt eating dinner with Gordon Novell and Mitchell WerBell. He is the black Idi Amin that has the Adolf Hitler pictures with Frank Churchill, the man in Africa who is the par excellence fascist. Now, you may think what you want, and I've never discussed publicly much about Gregory, except you know that I have no use for... last time I saw Gregory was at my home a couple of years ago when I said, why didn't you put in the thing about Larry McDonald and Larry Flynt in your book, Codename Zorro? Because this fellow was in a gallery a week before Martin Luther King was killed and talked about it. And you could check out all those allegations and ask the courts of the House Select Committee to do something about it. He's been on the side of the fascists, dancing around with them for so long. He didn't have to eat dinner with them. He absolutely didn't have to. Don Freed was in New York for a month. His play on Richard Nixon was off Broadway. He flew back. He walked into Larry Flynt's house. Down the steps comes Mitchell WerBell, who you would know instantly, and he says, "Mitch WerBell?" And he says, "Yeah." And Mitch calls Novell, "Gordon, come here." And to his credit, Don Freed turned around and went out of the door. You don't have to dine. Robinson Jeffers wrote a poem that corruption is not compulsory. And he walked away from it. We have choices. You don't think you have choices in life, you have choices. Dick Gregory is going to be in New York at some holistic fair where he talks about his dieting and his great health care and his jogging and so forth. And there's a lot of people, fighting the nuclear weapon. And it's Paul Krasner's going to be there doing stand-up comedy. All the world's a stage. So this person was telling me they were going to see Dick Gregory there. I said, yeah, you get up in the crowd and ask Gregory how he sits down for dinner with Mitchell WerBell and Gordon Novell. Explain that to the people. If you're so, enthusiastic to influence the young people on what's healthy, why don't you sit down? Why don't you ask those men who killed Martin Luther King once and for all, or John Kennedy, and get on with it? Now, these same people have a lot of influence on him. And just a month before Larry Flynt was shot, he ran an ad in the various papers, New York Times, and in his L.A. Free Press that he bought. And he offered $1 million reward to anybody who found the killer of John Kennedy. And he said, I believe there are many untapped witnesses to the events of the assassination, and he wanted information. I'm personally guaranteeing $1 million reward for an explanation and a conviction of who killed John Kennedy. If you have any personal information, please contact us. I guarantee I will protect every bit of evidence that we gather. I guarantee. A month later, he's shot. No detail is too small to aid in the public campaign to solve the murder. He says, you get in touch with me or an independent panel. You can call and collect to Ralph David Abernathy, who never did a thing to help the House Select Committee find Martin's killers, Mark Lane, you're supposed to give them the information. Or Dick Gregory, this is in 1978, Dick Gregory and Lane hadn't even told poor Larry a month before or simultaneously what was in Georgia. Lillian Smith and Robert Groden, and will determine the appropriate recipient, signed Larry Flynt. That was in 1978, and 1 month later, he was shot and left paralyzed. Well, this last week, on November the 18th, Larry Flynt runs the same article. Now, keep in mind that this was 1978, and he says, you tell me what witnesses you have, and we'll investigate the murders of John and Martin Luther King and so forth. December the 8th, 1978, Nicholas Harrock has an article in the New York Times that I've had on the air before. Memo discusses smuggling witnesses into Guyana. A memorandum found in the files of Reverend Jim Jones, apparently written by the People's Temple in San Francisco, discussed the possibility of using their lawyer Mark Lane to smuggle a witness in the Martin Luther King assassination down to Guyana using a false passport. Many of you know this story and many of you don't. They had a woman who died in a car accident, and they were going to take Grace Walden, a witness to the fact that James Earl Ray was not in the rooming house the day that Martin Luther King was shot. She saw somebody else. And the House Select Committee was investigating that murder, and she was in a mental hospital in Tennessee. And when the House Select Committee began investigating Martin Luther King's murder, Mark Lane was given custody of her as if she was something to rent out, like an Avis rent out this witness. She was supposed to use the passport of Maxine Swaney, S-W-A-N-E-Y, who had died, and they were similar in appearance, and Grace Walden would use her passport. They said there's one drawback, that if any traitor talked about it, they would be in trouble. Now, they were going to use this transference of a primary witness out of the country to Jonestown, where by June 78, they were just practicing decapitation of children, telling them how they were going to be decapitated. And they were brought in 3 pigs, and they gave them cyanide to show that cyanide was kinder, because in November they were going to be dead. November 78, they were going to be dead in Jonestown. And in early 78, in May of 78, when this came out simultaneously, they're running an ad, tell us your witnesses. Tell us who you know. How many witnesses would you need that would be sent to mental hospitals or down to places which I suspect the 180 people in the mental hospital in Grenada, that it was used for that kind of activity, and the secret there was bombing them out so that they wouldn't be identified, like the people in Jonestown couldn't be identified. So we're going to 1978, where Mark Lane, name is mentioned, in using a primary witness to something that he's been supposed to investigate for a few years, since Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. And 10 years later, they're shipping a primary witness when Congress has an investigation. The day he was supposed to testify, he ran out of the room and left and didn't have Grace Stevens testify, and he went down to Guyana because Leo Ryan was going to get into Jonestown, and he had to get there first and tell Jim Jones about, and then sit out in the orchard while 912 people died with Charles Gary. Now, in 1978, when all this was going on with Jim Jones and Mark Lane, and in June 68, they were telling the kids they were going to have to die, and they gave them different colored choices of the cyanide and rehearsing the decapitation or the poison choice. Dr. Shock bringing in 3 pigs and showing how fast and easy you die with cyanide just a little while before. You're supposed to send your information to Mark Lane and Dick Gregory, and absolute immunity. So what happens in November 18th, 1983? A full-page ad. Larry Flynt spends around $20,000 last week and runs it in the New York Times. Bring me, like the Statue of Liberty, bring me your tired and your poor. Once again, reward. Tell us who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and John Paisley. The same Bernard Fensterwald of the CIA that represents John McCloy and Mitchell WerBell also represents Marianne Paisley. And he says, I will grant you immunity, the same immunity you got then. And look at the danger. I hope I make this clear, the implication. Dick Gregory, Mitchell WerBell, and Gordon Novell at the dining room of Larry Flynt, and they're placing an ad saying, tell us who you know was involved in these murders. Now, in 1978, when this happened, I was horrified, knowing the track record of those two guys, okay? Lane and Gregory and Groden, the whole story. And I was disgusted because I called it then a vacuum cleaner action. And maybe some of you have those tapes and we can go back and play it. I said, Larry Flynt is running an ad, and you're going to put information in there. Then the remaining witnesses can be offed with automobile accidents, poison, go to mental hospitals. You're sucking in people who know something, and you can wipe them out very nicely, and nobody will know why they die. You simply turn their pocket inside out, and every murder is a robbery. You put a joint in their pocket, and it's a drug arrest, or a little white powder. I mean, buy a little powdered sugar and spread it around. You drop the powder, and you say it's cocaine. Or you put their pocket, or take the purse and snatch it, and take the coins, and obviously it was a murder for money, case closed. The coroner says it's closed. Now, this is the horrendous thing. If you can visualize these men sitting in the home at a time, and I don't know when they're going out. Will they go out if he dumps into the ocean? Will they take over the home? It's, the $5 million home in Bel Air. Is it theirs? The oil paintings, the chandeliers. Is this going to be the headquarters for the CIA in the future? How do you get them out when they're the government and the government steps in? I can't make it any more clear. It is a tragedy. It is something I've seen in its many forms for 20 years. There are a lot of movies I could have seen during the year. There are a lot of things I could have attended, or parties. There were a lot of different activities where you take time off and just lay back. And I felt there was an urgency to the now. 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the now is here, just like that quote I mentioned about the artist. Then is now. What happened when those people took over the government is escalating right now. The total Anschluss, the takeover of Central America, of every country. And then next it'll be the North Pacific, and then it'll be to surround Russia and go into Poland and begin that lovely little war that they've been wanting for so long. Kennedy was killed by the Pentagon, by the Defense Department, by the Fourth Reich, and people like Herman Abst are alive today. They're still doing their business. They're right in the Vatican. Incidentally, I don't know if many of you saw it. It wasn't in the news, except I saw it in the San Jose Mercury and the San Francisco Chronicle, and not the Eastern papers. The Popessa, the woman that took care of Cardinal Pacelli and nursed him when he was sick and depressed, when he lived in Germany, and then he went on to become the Pope, Pius XII. She describes in her biography, or autobiography, just before she died. She died just last week. She described her experience being there when the cardinal gave young Adolf Hitler money and began to fund him for the Anschluss that took place then a few years later, and she describes that scene where the money is handed over to young Adolf. Now, she died and left some things out of her book that she didn't want in her book until she passed away for secrecy reasons, and one of the things was that she housed with the Vatican the children of the Romanovs, that they lived, and that the story that the Romanov children died was a lie, that the Vatican protected them, and the anti-Russian propaganda went on. I once heard that, read several places, that in exchange for the Romanov family surviving, Lenin was allowed to go from Switzerland, that book about the sealed train, to the Soviet Union and become head of the Soviet Union. If the story of the Tsar held tight, that they had died, he could go back and run the government so that the Tsar family could live. And just this last week, there were stories that, in fact, the Vatican took care of them. Well, American history is now just a few more words. We've got about 1 minute. No, we don't even have a minute to talk about Mitchell WerBell. If you're interested in him, there's 40, 60, 80 pages. The book called Spooks by Jim Hogan. It's a paperback, or you can get it at your library. This is an American tragedy. This is one more shock to me. This is a real shock. I think it's probably one of the hardest weeks I've ever had in the research that I've done. We've had the accident in the family when Bonnie was killed, and Marvin got his LSD from the Gilmans, from the CIA, when I was in New Orleans with Jim Garrison. I said to Larry Flynt today, I said, look, my own son got LSD and wanted to kill himself several times, and that's what they've given you. And we'll get you the same doctors. You can get the same care. So if I get Larry Flynt in a mental hospital this week, and if they kill him there, I'm responsible. He doesn't get in, he's a dead duck. And that is the sad part of this thing. I can't see a way to survive, and we'll see what brings next week. This is the anniversary of Kennedy's death, and this is a real American tragedy. This is freedom of the press, American style, and this is Mae Brussel on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.